Kia ora. Hello. Good evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Dharawal country. I acknowledge ancestors and elders of the Dharawal country. I acknowledge that I'm on stolen, unceded land, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the first poets of this continent, so-called Australia, and I extend my acknowledgement to any First Nations people that might be watching. At this moment, I'd encourage you to leave a comment, and the comment being the country that you're on tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Annie Tufiu. I'm an Australian-born Māori, and I whakapapa. I'm connected to the Northland of Aotearoa, to Pangaru and Whiu. I acknowledge my ancestors. Tonight's session is incredible. We're in for a treat. 3 remarkable Indigenous editors who are coming together for a yarn. This session is called Deadly Editors Talking First Nations Anthologies. As a senior project manager at Red Room Poetry, I'm really honoured to have helped pull this program together. This particular session is in partnership with Red Dirt Festival, and Red Room Poetry sincerely thanks working in partnership with Laurie May and Red Dirt Poetry. Make sure you check out all of the other amazing sessions that Laurie May has produced. This particular session features 3 deadly editors. Firstly, Janine Lane. Janine recently edited Whiu for All Times, which is a First Nations anthology co-produced between Red Room Poetry and Magabala Publishers. Secondly, tonight, Ellen van Neerven will be in conversation as well. Ellen has recently edited Homeland Calling, the anthology, published through Desert Pea Media. And the third person in conversation tonight is Alison Whittaker. Alison has just edited the anthology Firefront, published through University of Queensland Press. These 3 anthologies are remarkable and light the way for so much more, so many more Indigenous anthologies, and it's really exciting that we're going to hear from Janine, Alison and Ellen tonight. Throughout the session, we will be giving away 3 packs of each book. So thank you to Magabala, Desert Pea and University of Queensland Press for donating these books. To go into the draw, you need to stay online after the session, and there will be 3 questions that we will ask. That the answers will come from the session. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Jeanine Leane, Ellen van Neerven and Alison Whittaker. Enjoy.
Jingaree, hello. I'm joined today with Alison and Janine. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Alison, you go first.
Sure. Okay. Yama, everyone. I'm Alison. I'm a Gomeroi woman. I grew up in Ghana on the banks of the Namoi, a really important river. I'm here today to talk a little bit about Firefront, which is a collection that I helped edit of First Nations poetry and essays.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Jeanine. I belong to the Wiradjuri people from southwestern New South Wales, near Gundagai on the Murrumbidgee River, also a very important river. I'd like to acknowledge my elders who raised me up, and I'd also like to acknowledge today that I'm on Ngunnawal country in Canberra, talking to you today from this beautiful cold country in Canberra.
Thank you.
And recently had the privilege of curating and editing Whiu, a collection of First Nations poetry by Magabala Books.
Beautiful, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in Meanjin, near Maiwa, the Brisbane River, and acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people that this country belongs to, as my own ancestors, the Mulunjali Yugambeh people from the country between the Logan and Albert Rivers, just south of Meanjin. I edited a book called Homeland Calling, which also came out this year. So the three of us, both being First Nations writers as well as wearing a lot of other hats, the three of us edited 3 poetry collections by First Nations writers, and they all happen to have come out in the same year. So you could really, I guess, maybe perhaps call this a bit of a movement. That these 3 books happen to be out at the same time. So the 3 books are quite different. So I'd like the opportunity for us to maybe talk a little bit about the collection, how it came about, and maybe talk a little bit also about the title of the work. Do you want to go first, Jeanine?
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, the title of the work is Whiu, which means it's a Wiradjuri word, and given I had the privilege of editing this anthology, which came about through Red Poetry, experimental poetry and online poetry and all sorts of poetry in Sydney, and with all of the Red Room poetry projects, they always invite First Nations writers. So there was a wealth of projects and there was a wealth of First Nations writing sort of already uncut from various Red Room projects. And when I was given the privilege of curating these wonderful works, I chose the name Whiu because in Wiradjuri it means still and yet and for all times. And it really means all times are inseparable and no time is ever over and all times are finished and living around us. And I realised across the many different languages of Australia that every language has a word that means for all times. And I thought it would be a good title for this collection of First Nations works, creative works, uncut and uncensored, which was hence the time, transtemporal nature of the book, and some of those kidnapped memories that are held hostage to some of the false claims around settlement. Yeah, so I thought that was a name that would speak to the strength of the kind of writing that the anthology was going to.
Yeah, wow, so strong. And I think the title is beautiful. Thank you for explaining the meaning, which is, it's a word that can't be translated in just one English word, so it kind of speaks to the depth of a phrase like that doesn't have a direct translation. Alison, did you want to talk a little bit about Firefront?
Before I talk any further, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Maori, over which sovereignty was never ceded. and Firefront was edited here and on many other countries as well. It came together again with an approach by UQP. So it seems that maybe a common theme in our conversation is that publishers are seeing the power and the movement that's behind First Nations poetry right now. And Firefront, the title itself, kind of came about from this idea that one of the transformative potential of power, of fire, and also the massive power, the ecological force, and the place that fire has. It's a metaphor for thinking also about the impact of First Nations poetry, in that its potential, its practices have been building up for a really, really, really long time. And what's happened now is the fire is tracked up, the wind has changed, and that really long precedent has kind of become a front by which First Nations poetry is beginning to be heard, maybe in a way that it hasn't been before. Firefront was made up of poems that had been published. So the role as editor was maybe a little bit different to other editorial roles. It was just trying to pull together these threads to represent what's happening in the timeless kind of state of First Nations poetry, how it kind of came about, the work that went into it, but also how the poems all related to one another. And that's why this collection also involved reflecting on the impact that these poems have had on them, which is really exciting, not only to see that poetry is being produced and is incredible in its own right, but that it has this real kind of social reality for mob, that it does something in the world. Really, really exciting to me.
Beautiful, thank you. So a little bit about the book that I had the privilege of, and again, I think we'll talk about this further, but the word editor, I picked up on Jeanine saying curated, so I'm going to use that for this book as well. I curated what I was approached by Desert P Media to put together. The full title was Homeland Calling, Words from a New Generation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voices. So it's a collection of poems, creative hip-hop lyrics that channel culture and challenge stereotypes. And it's written by First Nations youth from communities all around Australia. So a lot of these young people are in high school, and they're exploring, even though, these works are coming from many different places, so there's that diversity, there's a lot of common threads around that work. So I got the pieces kind of fully formed because they were already, you can check out the YouTube. There are already music videos and songs that you can download on Spotify or YouTube. But my role was to be a bit of a caretaker for that work and put it into a form that would suit the printed book, if you like. And the title Homeland Calling comes from one of the songs by the Lura Collective. So it's like that's also what I wanted to do when I was editing it, because it also has section titles. I would always use the lyrics from the songs themselves as a way to frame the book. It was sort of, it was a lot. I think, I can't remember the exact amount of pieces in there, but I think there's about 40 or 50 different pieces. So it was it's a really great snapshot of like what young people are thinking and wanting. It was a real honor to do that. And I wanted to ask about your previous experiences editing or curating projects like this, if this had been your first time, or whether there was other experiences that contributed to how you did, what your processes were for editing this book.
Mm.
Do you want to go first, Jeanine?
Thanks again, Ellen. Yeah, I saw it more like a gathering process. Like the term editing, that wasn't appropriate for this whole different approach that I wanted to take with this work. I have edited. This is the first time I've had the privilege of doing anything this good. In terms of other and this time now I'm in conventional editing experiences I've had. Like, I've edited, obviously, in my line of work, many, several academic works and longer works of prose and certainly individual poems. But this was my first time having the privilege of sort of working with this tremendous uncensored and uncut gatherings from First Nations people. And also, I've gone through a few editing processes myself, and I was conscious of the fact of things that I found difficult about working with editors, largely non-Indigenous editors.
Have you ever worked with an Aboriginal editor? Sorry to jump in. Have you ever worked with an Aboriginal editor?
Yeah, no. Apart from, not extensively, apart from like the bits and pieces that you edited some of my poems for a particular collection, Ellen. So a little bit, but not for a whole work. So I haven't had that privilege. And when I was thinking about how, I also had the privilege of introducing this book. So and I like to think about gathering because it's a ongoing cultural metaphor for the way we were, and for this practice we had of gathering all sorts of things that nurture and sustain us and that help us remember, and our writing as a bigger extension of that. And I thought, like, this collection is unique in the following ways, because it really had the heart and soul of First Nations communities across Australia in it, and it spoke across the geopolitically federated nation, the countries that are underneath that. And it brought together this huge demographic of voices from people in high school who had never been published before, older people who had never been published before, to people who were emerging, who had, say, didn't own a book, but had appeared in other anthologies and had their names about a little bit, to some of our really acclaimed and established poets like Ali Kobe Eckermann, for example, yourself. And I think the consultation process for this collection was one of the things that made it a bit of a benchmark in publishing, because it was completely, I started not with the assumption of sifting, of editing in its conventional sense as a sifting and sorting process, or not kind of constrained by this Western idea that only an elite can produce literature. When I came to this, I had the privilege of coming to this, I approached it with not just the assumption, but the belief, like, everyone's a poet, and poetry, like, it's nothing else. It's not, what's in the heart and the mind of people at any particular time. It's not just this kind of sterile, stylized kind of safe message on a page that it can become if you take it in its pure Western sense. So with this in mind, it just became like a question of me facilitating and talking with the poets who'd already brought forth these tremendous gatherings, and just seeing how best they wanted their works to move from that digital platform and to blossom on a page. But it was not about, and the works in themselves were all polished in their own way. So it wasn't about me stylizing the work. It was about me drawing out, you know, what the people really, really want to say. And it's like, and the use of the language in this book is probably a first in Australian poetry, first languages. I think we're representing 12 first languages out of across the 34 poets. And they all come in terms of, well, there's the beautiful poems themselves that appear as the material form, but that many people, including myself, went on these beautiful language journeys with elders and custodians. And that's when I was explaining the title, Ellen, you alluded to the fact that a word like Whiu and many of our words, they don't translate exactly because they are beyond that thought and philosophy, but we can offer interpretations. And throughout this collection, we use that term, language interpretations, not language translations. And, you know, many custodians very generously provided those interpretations. And so it's a collection written for First Nations people and by First Nations people. And, you know, deliberately came to with no baggage of that and no limits and no borders or boundaries, and the works within were not intended to be trimmed or manipulated. I wasn't thinking about marketability or settler editors, or even having at that point, like, certainly there's going to be much to be gained from by a settler audience for reading this, but they weren't at the forefront of my mind or at my mind at all when I was facilitating this collection. And therefore, I think the collections are really radical in Aboriginal publishing.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm really into, I'm glad you mentioned that word radical, because I think that's sometimes when we do these things, that's what it is. Did you have any non-Indigenous influence in this work, or was it? I know that it's published by Mugabulla, which is an Indigenous-owned publishing house, and Rachel Bensala worked on this. Who's an Indigenous woman, one of our only people that is working in the publishing industry, that has roles of power in the publishing industry. Was this a Black-owned model? Did you feel like there was any pressure?
No.
There was no pressure from outside?
No, we had, no non-Indigenous people involved in the fourth, a totally Black production. And of course we had the lovely Annie and Tamarin at the Red Room working with us, on technical things. But in terms of the actual input, in terms of the facilitating, it was, and that's why it is like this radical intervention and landmark, I think, in Australian publishing, for that and for its diversity of language, and for the, we'll have to think of a better word, for the facilitating protocols that it brought to the forward. And I also wanted to say that the projects that the Red Room does and the poems within this anthology that I realised go far beyond acknowledging poetry as just a beautiful art form, which it is, but they go far beyond recognising poetry as a beautiful art form, and for its capacity for far-reaching impact and social justice and greater community awareness as well. So, yeah, I think that's something that really distinguishes this collection.
Alison, did you want to answer that question? Sorry, I'm trying to give you like eyes, but it's sort of hard on the Zoom.
It's so hard. Sorry. I'm still kind of reeling from what Janine said. I think the development of, again, I don't have words for it yet, but the development of curatorial protocols in doing this kind of editing, and also in accepting pieces as they are, which was kind of already built in to Firefront, even though it wasn't with the First Nations publisher, simply by virtue of the fact that we were taking published works as part of the, I guess you'd say, like the Black public record of poetry. But I'm trying to think about, as you said, Ellen, and as you said, Jeanine, kind of the radical possibilities of not having that involvement, of not editing to anticipate legibility, not to like try and make stuff understandable to non-Indigenous people, to be able to produce meaning amongst ourselves as us as the intended audience, and to not have that curatorial pressure coming from the outside. I'm excited about what it means to have 3 anthologies with such a different process, and that we can learn from one another in that. I certainly learned, probably jumping ahead here, but I really learned a lot from this process about what is possible when you're bringing, again, for mine, like existing poems into relation with one another, and also what it means to honor the work of the poets who produced them and their families, and the mass of kind of contextual knowledge that comes with the poems that is not always easy to bring with it once it's detached from the poetry that it was written alongside. So to be able to have that kind of long process of relationship and responsibility that comes with a publisher like Magabala, and also that comes from your curatorial, your gathering leadership, your gathering process, Jeanine, is really exciting for me. And that's something that I tried to supplement with, I guess, the interpretive notes from the essayists in Firefront, to try and give that kind of social context. But I mean, no collection of poetry is going to be able to do that perfectly, and it's important that this renewed interest in our poetry that's accumulating in anthologies doesn't end here, and that we continue to learn about how to do it.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is decolonizing, and we're talking about documenting and implementing process. Like it's almost like the process is as important as the product, making sure that those processes are continued, and that these books have a legacy, an artistic legacy, but also a cultural legacy and a communication, that these processes are there. And while you both are talking, I'm just reflecting on my own editing journey as someone who, fresh out of uni, received an opportunity to work as an editor, to be trained as an editor on First Nations authored text in a project that you both know very well called Black and White, which is still continuing, about to have a 10-year anniversary, maybe later this year or next year. When I started training as an editor, as someone who, I think the term editor has this kind of association, you've got your red pen and you're correcting. It's almost like a correcting, but very much realized that the role that I had was a social exchange. I was working with the writers to, question and answer. We were both asking questions of each other to help the writer realize the true potential of what they want to do, and how important timing was as well. Like you can't rush things, and that sometimes there would be a waiting for the moment to arrive. And so it's not a short process by any means. These writers, I was fortunate with the project to be able to work with writers on their manuscripts over a 12-month period. So you get to know each other really, really well. So I was just thinking that back then I sort of saw my role as a bridging. I saw myself as a bridge between the writer and the publishing industry. And in some ways, perhaps, things have evolved that, where I saw myself as someone as in the middle, I don't think that there has to be that bridging anymore. I think it's what Janine's saying, that we don't have to worry about legibility to white readership. We can write, we can publish on our own terms and conditions and publish for our mob. And I think that's the most radical, going outside of the white gaze and going, if like just and creating our own publishing. I think that's where we're headed. Did any of you want to speak to that?
Um, just pick up on, it's really important that we become the subjects of our own gazes. Yeah, not just because we've been the subject of the white gaze for too long, and it's been very crippling, and across the publishing scene. So it is, it's very important that we become the subjects of our own literary gaze. Yeah.
We're taking a small pause in the yarn at this minute to share with you a really special pre-recorded performance by Declan Ferbagillic, whose work features in all three anthologies, Whiu, Homeland Calling and Firefront. Declan Ferbagillic is an Arante playwright, artist, educator, performer and musician with Aboriginal and Irish Anglo ancestry. His works include the multi-award-winning play Big House Dreaming and Scar Trees, a theatre as education play commissioned by Ilbageri Theatre Company. Declan has had prose, poetry and essays published by Affirm Press, Southerly, Centre for Indigenous Story and, of course, Red Room Poetry. Declan is currently working on a new play for the Melbourne Theatre Company, where he is a resident writer in their next stage program. This is Bigger Than School Stuff by Declan Ferbagillic.
Everyone's sitting on the carpet, except Latoya, who's sitting under a desk holding her hair over her face. The other bush kids sit in groups whispering in Pitjantjatjara, Walpri and Aranda. The town kids are spread out amongst a few white kids. Tyrone's a town kid sitting next to me. I help Mr. Graham run the maths games. Then I hand out spelling sheets. Then I work with Tyrone. When I work with Tyrone, he's sussing me out. He speaks English. Hey, what's your name again? Declan. Declan what? And where you from? Here? What? Alice Springs? Hey, me too. He holds up his hand and I slap it high five. We are the same colour. Oi, do you know my brother Daniel? He asks. Yeah, Russ, I used to teach him at Bradshaw. Tyrone's eyes grow wide. I can tell that with my baggy jeans and my cap, I'm just about the coolest person he knows. After lunch, the kids line up. Still the bush kids huddle together. Latoya, who was sitting under the desk, wheels around the corner with her head back and her chest out, grinning and screaming with laughter. She calls out in a shrill cackle to a couple of bush kids in their native tongue. Tyrone's head whips around. He seizes the moment like a dagger. I watch their eyes meet, and there's this recognition, a flicker, a crackling stillness. For a moment it's like anything could happen. Then Tyrone smirks and hurls a mouthful of gibberish at Latoya, mimicking the subtle tones and undulations of Aranda, fashioning them into a torpedo of abuse that ploughs into her chest. Her torso deflates, her brow darkens and her shoulders fall forwards. Her face disappears back behind her hair, and she glares out at Tyrone with the righteous fury of a woman scorned. She snarls under her breath, 2 words that she knows he'll understand. Fuck you. Tyrone's not hurt, but he's outraged. Oi, Declan, did you hear it? Latoya said F you to me? Yeah, I heard, Tyrone, I heard. As Latoya and the others go inside, I tell Tyrone to sit with me on the low bench by the racks of school bags. Tyrone, do you know what language Latoya was speaking? He shakes his head. She was speaking Aranda. Do you know whose language that is? Yeah, that's my language, he says. Yeah, I say. That's my language too. That's our language. How do you think Latoya's going to feel next time she wants to speak our language at school? He shrugs. Maybe bad, he says. Yeah. Yeah, maybe she'll feel bad. She might feel shame. Because what you did there, you made her feel shame for that language. For our language. You understand that? I say, Tyrone, all our families used to speak that language here. And then slowly people stopped. They lost it. It got taken away, or they forgot it, or it got covered up by that shame. We're lucky we still got it. But if we make people shame for speaking that language, they're not going to speak it. And then we won't have it anymore. And our mob will get real lonely for that language. Like lots of us already are. And this country, our country that we're on here, it gets real lonely for that language too. Do you understand? Tyrone nods. Bryce, you're not in trouble. Not like school trouble. This is bigger than school stuff. We got responsibilities here. We got to look after that language best we can. Okay? Okay, he says. And together we walk back into the classroom and sit down on the mat.
I'm also just thinking about poetry as being such a natural for us mob, but perhaps it gets overlooked in a Western European gaze where the novel is seen to be at the top and non-fiction. If you see various prizes like the Stella Prize only accepting entries from fiction, non-fiction, not having poetry, which does, it cuts out a whole heap of writers, important writing. Do you also both see that poetry is located in the wider Australian literature?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I think that it is a great shame, and I don't know why it is that Australia is so like that with short forms. Because oh wow, it's certainly not my favorite country, but I have to say that there is one thing I like about the United States, and they they value their poets a lot more, and the idea of a poetry collection. And I don't know what it is. It might be this great colonial fascination with bigness, something like that. You know, the better, and can't appreciate the economy of the small. Um, but I mean, I think that you're right. I think you're right. Poetry is seen to be a bit of a lesser, and I think that's something probably that we can work towards changing. I think because so many of us are poets. I think that just about all of us are poets, and like before, this might be jumping ahead a bit too. I might be answering your next question, but then I can be quiet for a while and Alison can talk for a while. But uh, before Firefront and home Homefront, is it? Homeland Calling. Sorry, Ellen. Before Firefront and Homeland Calling, um, there was a bit of a dearth and wow of First Nations anthologies out there. I was noticing that because part of what I do is I'm like a bit of a book publishing book historian, and in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was a younger, more emerging writer or even unpublished, there were quite a few anthologies and of collections of poetry and short stories together that I really liked as well. Um, for example, there was, Arnie Rosemary Vandenberg's wonderful collection, Those Who Remain Will Always Remember, that came out in 2000. And there was also, of course, Inside Black Australia, 1985, which Uncle Kevin Gilbert, and Across Country, Stories from Aboriginal Australia, that was actually an ABC book and edited by Kerry Davis. But there's just some wonderful writers in there like John McBurke, Uncle Bruce Pascoe, and once again it's also an eclectic collection of poetry and short stories. And there was Untreated by Josie Douglas, 2001. Once again, stories and poems. And the wonderful Black Lives Rainbow Visions by Jenny Martiniello, 2000. And a lot of local anthologies came out that were greatly underrated in poetry as well, like Us Mob Writing, which was published by a small publisher, Anna Carey. And there was also Talking Ink from Oka, speaking of Jenny Martiniello, and Close the Business, which was also Arnie Carey. And they, yeah, really important works and ones that I know I grew great strength from. And then there seemed to be a bit of a drought for poetry, anthologies. So I was absolutely delighted that these three works came out. And I think also outside Australia, I draw inspiration from the scene of First Nations writing as well. And this great collection came out earlier this year, and I loved it because it was genreless and it was uncensored, and in many ways it was bringing these really inconvenient stories of First Nations people to the fore, and I just loved it. It was called Shapes of Native Nonfiction. It's a North American, obviously, First Nations collection of I just let me call it writing because it didn't want to define itself. I suppose if you had to use one term, you might say lyric essay, which was all that kind of a series of mixed genres. But yeah, I really like that because sometimes I'm concerned that, when you're talking about this, the intervention of publishers, that writing swings too much between the uncritical and the romantic. in terms of representations of us, or the complete trauma victim. And then there's not enough about that messy, unresolved of realism that we all live in. And, it's sort of very polarized. And so I drew a lot of inspiration from that book recently too, Shapes of North American Native Nonfiction.
Shapes. Yeah, I've got that book at home. It's a beautiful book. It's. I thank you for mentioning all those collections, because we're really just, they're greatly undervalued, and it needs to be known that our anthologies are just following in the footsteps of tracks that have already been made. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, Alison, how how, when you were conceiving what your book was going to look like, and you talked a lot about the relational connections between the poems, and having these sections with essays by blackfellas, contextualizing the work. How did you come up with that concept?
Yeah. So it was just realizing that the poems had to have something that contextualized them. So some of the poems that actually come from the anthologies that you just mentioned, Janine, themselves. So a lot of Mob had published collectively, totally original work, as part of these kind of literary collectives that formed around anthologies. And so acknowledging the of infrastructural work, but also the huge amount, I think, of that kind of curatorial gathering thinking had already been done. And so when I was taking poems like this kind of out of their context of that collective development in which they took place, this might sound a bit naff. I can't find another way to explain it, but I didn't want them to be lonely. I wanted them to have a way of kind of being with the other poems that's more than just here's this book. And so I pulled the poems together, and the ones that I felt were having a conversation with one another, they had a similar way of thinking, they had a similar way of doing, or they talked about the same subject matter. I wanted them to be together. And that is kind of how the process developed. The essays also came about because I was anxious about, and I don't know if either of you two have reflections on this. This is probably my main concern when I was pulling it together. I was anxious that kind of my subjectivity and my frame of mind and my understanding of verse was going to shape this collection in a way that was a detriment to the poets. So I wanted to make sure there was a diversity of voices of Mob who could demonstrate the realness and the impact of these poems. And also in a way to demonstrate that it's not just Mob like us, it's not just poetry lovers who are really, really embedded in First Nations poetry in our community. It's a really fundamental social architecture. And I couldn't do it without that. And maybe this is kind of going back to your earlier question, Ellen, but also on the question of literary prizes and how recognition of poetry is doled out, that focus in kind of the Western literary tradition on the single author is such a limit to anthologies being created as well, because that's another thing about these literary prizes, very recognized poetry, but none recognize collective authorship. And that does a huge disservice, especially to the earlier practices, the earlier anthologies we've seen, that were not paid attention to by the white literary establishment because they had relationality at their center. And now that same industry is kind of turning around and turning to people like us, to editors and curators and gatherers, and they're now trying to capitalize is the wrong word, but they're trying to again draw from that relationality in our work. And so I wonder about the tension in that, and I guess how we deal with it. If kind of anthologies are going to become in their second or third wave, a more established practice for us.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you raised about or are you sort of saying the commodification of the communal, the way that we work together and write together? Yeah, you're sort of worried about the future of that if it's in the wrong hands?
I'm really not sure. I mean, the point that I was trying to get at is that there's a renewed interest in Indigenous literature and Indigenous poetry, and to the extent that it understands the way that we do things, and makes changes to the way that it does things so that we can do things the right way. I get anxious that of pressure on mob who kind of enter into this space. And we are sometimes at risk of forgetting the long precedent of stuff behind us. And so this is discussions happening in the Black literary community generally, but with a lot of attention on especially emerging First Nations writers right now. How do we make sure that people aren't exploited and that their stories are taken seriously? They're taken seriously as literary people of their craft, but also as members of a community to whom they're ultimately responsible.
Responsible too. Yeah. What do you think, Jeanine?
Yeah, look, thanks, Ellen. Alison touched on so many good points there. Like, yes, commodification, and the singling out process is what always gets to me about the publishing model that we live with at the moment. And Alison mentioned, the focus on emerging and new, and it's like a bit of an overhang from colonial discovery narratives to me, discover, exploit, extract. But these anthologies, which Alison so beautifully pointed out, that represent the longevity of us and the strength of us and the collectiveness of us, are so important. And it is so important to do, I think, jumping back to the work I mentioned earlier, that shapes book. It is so important to, when publishers think they know us, then I think we're in trouble. And when they think that they know an Indigenous story, which you start to hear, stories about, well, my story got rejected because it wasn't a very Aboriginal story. And who tells you this? A white publisher? Now we're in trouble when publishers think they know us, because then I think we've become a commodity and we've sort of like been dug up by those discovery narratives. And I guess,
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
Sorry, you go. Oh, I was just, when I came home from work one day and I said to Mum, I'm editing an anthology of poetry, and she said, "Anthology? What's that? Is that like anthropology?" And it did make me think, and committing acts of violence towards us as people, and kind of my publishing is always trying to make sure that we are thriving as a people, and we, that there's a sense of that something has. I like the word that you said, Jeanine. I think you said, did you say bloom?
Yeah, bloom and blossom.
That there's a bloom and blossom. That there's a life at the end of the process rather than death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that there's a life at the end of the process, and that a writer is not just reduced to this book that they once produced that was new at the time, but is now, no longer. And I guess one of the stunning things about Whiu as a collection, I try, like, it's hard and people market it as that, but I know exactly what your mum meant about anthology, and that is the root word. Like, yeah, anthologize means kind of like showcase, but the idea of showcasing involves this tremendous sifting and sorting as to what is the public image. And so I'm trying to call it a collection or gatherings. Actually, I'd like to call it a gathering. But I emphasised, I likened it to a weave across the strength of us. The collection was like a weave across the strength of us, across country, across age, across language, across gender, across orientation, across experience, across ability, and across opinion. And it's what it did for all of us. It was not a singling out process. It was about what it did for all of us. And I sometimes think, well, publishers come after people when they think they're safe, or when they think it's a safe bet, or there's money to be made. But maybe we could work towards publishers being interested in coming after us, if you must put it that way, just for the breadth of the stories that might be there. Because I think we're in a bit of trouble when they start trying to market this story. Yeah. Market a particular brand of Aboriginality. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I wanted to ask you both about if you. I know we said we're against singling out, but if you could choose a piece from your collection that really talk to the value of this piece, why you included it, and what it means to you, and give us a bit of a background about it.
Oh, sure. Can you guys hear me? I think I might be stuck. You can hear me? Okay, fantastic. Good. Again, I'm against singling out, but I understand the value of the
I know
exercise.
it's hard,
I'm
isn't it?
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm gonna choose. It's hard. Okay, I want to personally for all of the poems in all of our collections, and I'm choosing this for illustrative purposes only. But I want to. There's kind of a in Firefront. I don't know if I hold it up to the camera. And mine sit next to each other as an illustration of the way that poetry relates to one another, and also in the way that it's on and has often a subject matter real world relationships. So these are two poems written about and to the same man who passed away recently, and a way of talking about broader systems, the colony and decolonization, while also focusing on relationships. And I don't want to read them out because I don't really want to speak over them.
No.
Yeah.
No.
But these are poems that also echo one another in style, that they feel intimate while pitching to some not universal, some public shared experience that many of us all relate to, without losing their specificity about who they're actually written to and about. And I think a lot of mob straddle that line in the creation of poetry between relationships that we're responsible to and for in the day-to-day, while also wanting to express something that's going to our communities and that we're going to feel proud of at the end of the day. I think those two poems demonstrate that wonderfully, perfectly.
Thank you. Jeanine?
Yeah, I just wanted to backtrack slightly to what Alison said. But yeah, those son of mine and grandfather, yeah, they were beautiful, and they just say what you were talking about as well, Alison, about the longevity, the continuation, the trajectory of us, it's not really that well understood. But then when you see those poems, it's so powerful. They were searing. Yeah, and I also wanted to reiterate what Alison said about, I'm very much against singling out. But I did choose some beautiful words, and I want to speak to the whole strength of the collection. And like I mentioned, I used the analogy of a basket when I was writing the foreword, because a basket or a net, because in some way or other, across this continent, although we were really diverse people, we all did some kind of weaving. So I used that basket and a net metaphor, because at the end of it you come up with a beautiful basket or a fishing net, but it's not just the basket at the end, it's the process of the basket, and every strand, the basket doesn't stand up without every single strand. And so it was about every strand of the basket that came together to make the Whiu, like the sublime vessel that it is. But I did choose some beautiful words up front for the forward by a Sydney-based, and the name of the poem was called a little excerpt from Dreaming Track, because it captured what we wanted to do about all times. And this is not the whole piece, but these words are beautiful. Hopefulness still blooms and remains strong, claps a beat, breaks through layers of questions. We ask ourselves in the stillness of contemplation and stay reminded that beauty still resides here after 228 years in silence. And that poem was written a couple of years ago, and now we've had 332 years. But, works like Whiu, like Homelands and like Firefront, they break the silence that poem speaks of, and I said, unleash the beauty of First Nations words that we have, and tell everyone that we've always been here. And I said in another interview yesterday too that
beautiful.
I wasn't thinking of settler Australia when I edited this anthology, and when I had the privilege of, curating all these gatherings. But there is much in there for a settler audience to gain, because people will never really get to know First Nations people or the first peoples of this country until you read what's in our hearts and in our minds, and what our aspirations are, that are uncut and uncensored and unstylized and uncolonial handled by any kind of, marketing or publishing process. And you won't know up until you read these offerings. And we are offering them to you. We're generous people. Yeah.
We are. Yeah, thank you. These collections are, I couldn't have said it better myself. These collections are beautiful offerings. I want to encourage everybody to buy each of them. That's the thing. Don't just buy one, buy all of them, because they're all very different, and they all contain different multitudes. I love Declan Ferbagillic's piece in your collection, Jeanine, and I love that it has an author note that talks to how Declan has laid it out on the page. It talks about it being an oral history. There's the Aranda and the English together side by side. And I love Declan's honesty in talking about it as a piece that is still in flux, it's still evolving and continuing. I love Romaine Morton's poem in Firefront. I love Romaine's poetry. Incredible to have that in the collection. And the piece that I'm going to single out of Homeland Calling is a piece called People of the Red Sunset by B-Town Warriors, who are young people who were at the time in 2016 when they wrote it, enrolled at Burke High School in far western New South Wales. It's a beautiful piece that speaks about the Darling River and country out there. I think this is a beautiful place to end. Unless each of you had any final words, I've certainly learnt so much. It's been hugely insightful and inspiring for me. But yeah, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
I'll just say, just reiterate your sentiments. I'd like to say thanks to both of you because it was a wonderful conversation and I learned so much. So I want to say thanks to Ellen and Alison and to Red Dirt for giving us the opportunity to talk about these works. I say to the reading public, feel the texture of these sublime vessels and offerings that we're giving to you, because this is the living, breathing archive of the sum and strength of us. Thank you.
How could I supplement that? Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you so much, Janine. I have learnt so much from this yarn, which is, I guess, kind of an anthology of ideas in its own right, if we want to be tacky. Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Goodbye.